If you thought illegal immigration was bad,
The American public is worried, and I think they're rightfully worried, because the number one job of the federal government is to protect the country's security.
wait till you learn about the U.S. citizenship for sale racket.
It became very clear that in addition to the basic problem of selling visas for money, letting people in ahead of the rest of the people waiting to come here as immigrants, the corruption got to be a problem.
It's a little-known scandal of epic proportions. The EB-5 green card scam has swept the nation, and small towns like those in Vermont's impoverished Northeast Kingdom have been left holding the bag.
The fact that they were calling it Little Beirut and a hole in the ground was a deep concern for city officials. I call it an economic disaster for the area, for Newport.
At the end of the day, there were 100 separate bank accounts that were used and more than 1,000 transactions that they attempted to track as part of this investigation. This is the biggest EB-5 fraud in the country.
All thanks to a treacherous and corrupt federal law embraced by the Democratic leadership of the Green Mountain State.
The EB-5 program is the perfect example of how liberals like Bernie Sanders and Patrick Leahy, they're all for benefiting the rich and well-connected cronies. As long as the government is running the program.
Next on Michelle Malkin Investigates. Michelle Malkin Investigates. Now, here's Michelle Malkin.
The federal government, in its infinite wisdom, has been renewing a little-known employment-based visa scheme for decades. Designed to create jobs and stimulate economic growth, the EB-5 visa program has been riddled with fraud and abuse since it was signed into law in November of 1990. Part of what had been touted by the first Bush administration as comprehensive immigration reform. EB-5 basically puts the precious privilege of U.S. citizenship up to the highest foreign and politically connected bidders. The program allocates about 10,000 green cards a year to wealthy foreign investors who purportedly invest between $500,000 to $1 million in a new U.S. enterprise or troubled business. If the investment results in the creation of a meager 10 American jobs, stakeholders are given permanent resident status in the U.S. and a shortcut to citizenship, not only for them, but their spouses and children under the age of 21. Congress then lowered the investment standards by creating EB-5 regional centers, government-sanctioned business groups and corporate entities acting as middlemen to administer the immigrant investments and facilitate the visa peddling. This scheme created massive loopholes, allowing unscrupulous real estate developers to set their own agendas by sidestepping unenforceable regulations, ripping off foreign investors, and leaving rural communities with high unemployment in the dust. The ripple effect is directly affecting Americans who live in economically depressed areas. And if the money isn't being looted, it's being diverted to larger projects in wealthier urban areas. A proposed $1.7 billion condo tower on Manhattan's Billionaire Row in New York City. A 44-story skyscraper in the heart of Seattle's financial district priced at $440 million. The $8 billion Hunters Point shipyard project in San Francisco. Not exactly strip malls and Walmarts in small-town USA that would have created much-needed jobs for Americans struggling to make ends meet. And who's subsidizing these billion-dollar projects? Wealthy foreigners who seek that golden ticket, permanent U.S. citizenship. So, how does a bustling big city magically become Detroit on paper to qualify for EB-5? Simply put, the program is being exploited by promoters and book cookers seeking ready capital for prominent speculative projects in economically prosperous districts.
Just before midnight on August 23, 2014, crowds gathered along the Las Vegas Strip for a massive fireworks display and the hope of catching a glimpse of high-profile celebrities, including Jamie Foxx, Lenny Kravitz, and Sharon Stone, as they hit the red carpet. The event the grand opening of the 1,620-room SLS Hotel and adjoining casino. The price tag for this extravagant renovation of the legendary Sahara Resort? $415 million. The amount seems reasonable considering the scale of the project, but state and federal officials were less than truthful about how this large chunk of money was supposed to be used. David North, a research fellow with the Center for Immigration Studies, is a prominent critic of the EB-5 system.
The money, instead of coming to investments in Appalachia, for instance, we're going to Park Avenue and downtown LA and glitzy parts of Miami. The program, as it grew more corrupt because there are many opportunities for many different kinds of people to do many different kinds of fraud.
According to a disturbing report by the Inspector General released in March of 2014, Deputy Director for the Department of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, was strong-armed by the self-serving Democratic Senate Minority Leader Harry Reid to fast-track visas for foreign investors, all part of an off-the-radar program called EB-5. The monies were pumped directly into Nevada's most expensive and lucrative development projects instead of being allocated to those in need, specifically unemployed Americans in rural areas in West Virginia, Oregon, and Vermont. Daniel Horowitz is a senior editor at Conservative Review and policy analyst specializing in immigration.
So it's no big surprise that you got people like Harry Reid, former Pennsylvania Governor Ed Rendell. The names are endless. All they have to do is make a call to USCIS offices and DHS and say, hey, I got a regional center, could you approve it? And even if it wouldn't otherwise have been approved based on the merits, connections matter.
As far as the EB-5 program is concerned, I don't think the Department of Homeland Security is paying as much attention to this program as it should. The Department of Homeland Security is not at the best place in the world to run a financial regulation activity. The financial regulations done by the Treasury, by Commerce, by the Small Business Administration, by SEC. These are institutions that deal with big money and deal with the manipulators of big money. And Department of Homeland Security is a bit out of its league here.
What the Inspector General report did not reveal was that the owner of the casino hired Reid's son, Rory, to provide legal representation for the project. Once Reid's abuse of political power in this and other corruption scandals was revealed, the senator abruptly announced his resignation, ending a 3-decade congressional career.
The reason why the entire EB-5 program has become oriented towards these glitzy rich areas in Vegas and New York is because of the inherent flaw in the entire program. Once they created the Regional Center program, they gave away this immigration program. They took it from the American people in a broad sense, and they gave it to cronies. They put it in the hands of big real estate moguls. So they're gonna build where they wanna build, and that's gonna determine where the investments are. And once the investments are there, the individual foreign investors are gonna do whatever it takes to get their visas.
And the fallout continued. On October 6, 2016, the clearly corrupt Deputy Director for the Department of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, announced his resignation.
It's no surprise that we see that the Deputy DHS Director, Mayorkas, was caught, according to the Inspector General of DHS's very thorough report. He was caught approving their regional centers when, based on the existing criteria, they should never have been approved.
The same IG report implicated Democratic Governor of Virginia Terry McAuliffe and Tony Rodham, brother of Hillary and a member of the faux heirs to the Camelot throne, the Clintons. Watchdogs called out the Department of Homeland Security for playing favorites in a McAuliffe-backed effort to win EB-5 funding for his electric car company, Green Tech Automotive. The tale got even more twisted when it was revealed that Rodham's company, Gulf Coast Funds Management, pooled and directed the monies to Green Tech. The kicker? Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State during much of the time that Gulf Coast and Green Tech were pressing for approvals to accept foreign investments.
The McAuliffes and the Clintons are as close as any political dynasty could be, they were able to get special treatment for their regional center, which probably wouldn't have been approved based on the scope of their project. The electric car companies need tremendous amount of subsidies to succeed, would not have been approved under the natural standards and regulations for the regional centers. But according to the Inspector General report, Mayorkas, the deputy DHS director, signed off on this regional center. It's a little bit hard to believe that the power of the McAuliffe and the Clinton name didn't have something to do with it.
Senator Harry Reid, Terry McAuliffe, and Tony Rodham weren't the only lying liberals exploiting their political and personal clout to take advantage of this corrupt visa-for-sale con game. Hard-left socialist Democrats like Senator Bernie Sanders, the liberal-minded lawmaker, Chuck Schumer, and U.S. Representative Gerald Nadler have been lining up to milk EB-5 for all it's worth. The program is so secretive and murky that its effectiveness in creating and lowering unemployment is unknown. With little tracking being done, virtually no information is publicly available about individual projects or the criteria used to get them approved. And neither state nor federal officials will provide even a list of the projects or their targeted areas, calling it proprietary company information. This unregulated train wreck of a program has created a nationwide surge in fraudulent development projects, and the feds are scrambling to cover their tracks.
Little did President George H.W. Bush know, but when he signed this significant and controversial piece of legislation back in 1990, the ramifications would send shockwaves through American cities and communities, both large and small. Set into motion countless SEC and local government investigations, and leave thousands suffering collateral damage as the result of schemes that exploited the immigrant investment program.
This bill is good for families, good for business, good for crime fighting, and good for America.
The legislation received strong bipartisan support, was considered a significant accomplishment for the Republican Party, and was sponsored by one of the most liberal Democrats on the Hill, Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy. Vermont's senior senator, the pushy Patrick Leahy, who was a strong supporter of the bill from the start, was particularly interested in the policy guidelines regarding EB-5. Anne Galloway covers politics and public policy for the Vermont-based investigative news service VTdigger.org and has been following the EB-5 story since 2011.
Senator Patrick Leahy is considered to be the godfather of the EB-5 program, and he's been involved in reauthorizing the program every 5 years since its inception in 1990.
Senator Patrick Leahy was in favor of the EB-5 program because he thought about it in its original terms. It would help depressed areas. And as a matter of fact, a lot of EB-5 money went into what's called the Northeast Kingdom, which is the furthest north part of the state of Vermont, which is a very depressed area.
In Vermont, I think that he thought it would give the state an opportunity to really develop tourism centers that could help the economy generally. We have certain parts of the state that are very impoverished, and the Northeast Kingdom is among them. And what keeps that region going are the ski areas. I wouldn't say disrepair necessarily, but they weren't really up to snuff for, the kinds of resorts that Americans like to go to. Patrick Leahy, who's always been concerned about employment in the state and the overall economy, thought it was a great idea. Who isn't against jobs?
The EB-5 program is the perfect example of how liberals like Bernie Sanders and Patrick Leahy, they're all for benefiting the rich and well-connected cronies. As long as the government is running the program, as long as it's not rooted in the free market, and as long as it benefits their political interests. And that's the perfect example. You had this boondoggle going on for years in Vermont, where they weren't just squandering one or two of the investors' funds, they squandered hundreds of millions of dollars. And they kowtowed to this program for years and never said a word. It's hard to imagine they didn't understand the inherent flaws in it.
Originally designated as a pilot program with a 2-year lifespan, EB-5 has been renewed nearly a dozen times in its 25-year history. And with each new passage of the package came another set of ambiguities that allowed real estate moguls to take advantage of both investors and those who would benefit from the job creation aspect of the program.
It was a very small little program that was designed to bring limited number of wealthy people as investors in the United States, and their money was supposed to go into particularly depressed rural areas. And that was part of the Immigration Act and was part of the immigration program for a number of years, and it wasn't used very much. And then in more recent years, so some very able and very assertive middlemen, largely from urban areas, have found this is a good source of what's called mezzanine financing at very low cost. So what the program now does, that wasn't what it was designed to do, is it essentially takes money from very wealthy Chinese and transfers it to wealthy Americans.
EB-5, like every other program in government, once it is enacted, no matter how damaging that program is, no matter how fraught with fraud and security concerns it might be, it can never be rescinded because it creates a very targeted but vocal and influential rent-seeking element within the government that helps perpetuate the program itself. The buzzword is always reform. We're gonna fix it.
But it soon became clear that the EB-5 exception had opened the door for gerrymandering by the Democrats' liberal faction.
So the technique for seeing to it that the money should go into low-income areas turned out to be a very poor technique. The government didn't take steps to change that and therefore allowed these gerrymandered, if you will, areas, which includes one very prosperous place, which is where you're putting your building, and then long stretch of territory, and over here there's a public housing project, which gives you the unemployment level that you need, and the government has allowed that to happen, and they shouldn't have. I personally spent 45 minutes with the census map, and I figured out that the depressed area included the White House of the United States.
Coming up, the SEC cracks the case and Vermont braces for impact.
The fraud was ongoing, but neither the feds nor the state government in Vermont knew about this, and they should have.
Patrick Leahy, I think, has told the press that he feels betrayed and that if the accusations are true, that he would be devastated by that information. And so that's why I think people have questions about the senator's involvement.
Next on MMI.
The liberal media will not drive this program, and liberal issues will not drive this program. We will drive this program. What we are here is pro-American, unabashed patriots. We feel positive about our country. We feel positive about our principles, and each and every night I'm going to come to you. I hope you'll join us in what is our new national town hall meeting here on television so we can discuss these issues, figure out how to get our country back, and move it forward.
Despite the fact that EB-5 was an ill-conceived, unregulated racket, or maybe precisely because no one was watching, the program's usage skyrocketed during the 2008 financial crisis. There were just 700 visas issued in 2007. By 2014, the program reached its quota of 10,000 visas and was forced to stop accepting applications. The same thing happened in 2015 and 2016. This may sound like a win-win for America's unemployed and rich visa-seeking foreigners, but there's plenty of misinformation out there about what's really going on with all that money. In practice, the program was benefiting opportunists and fleecing anyone who stood in its path. And worse, it was leaving America vulnerable to undesirables who could put our national security at risk. And now, part 2 of our investigation.
Between ISIS creating the worst refugee crisis since World War II and cyber threats from Russia and China, there's plenty of justified homeland insecurity these days. So when we have a government-sponsored money for visa strategy without basic oversight that could facilitate terrorist travel, narcotics trafficking, money laundering, or espionage, it's easy to see why some view the program as a threat to the safety of Americans. David North is a senior researcher with the Center for Immigration Studies think tank in Washington, D.C.
Well, obviously, if you have a clause in the immigration law which allows an open door simply by money, then somebody who has evil thoughts about the American system or the American government, who's got $500,000, and think of several nations around the world that might fall into that category, they could buy their way in. I think that's a real danger.
Indeed, the DHS Inspector General testified earlier this year that his office found EB-5 posed, quote, national security risks. But the more immediate threat is on a socioeconomic level. Residents of rural towns who have been directly affected by the sins of EB-5 are too busy warding off financial disasters in their economically depressed communities to worry about national security concerns. Consider the Northeast Kingdom, a sparsely populated region in Vermont with the highest rate of unemployment in the state. Paul Monet is the mayor of Newport, Vermont, and has served as a city official for over 20 years.
One of the economic challenges that we have faced has been the lack of jobs and what they call low-paying jobs. I consider hard-working people who some have to scrap to make a good living.
Ann Galloway is the executive director of the Vermont Journalism Trust and senior editor at the investigative news organization vtdigger.org.
There's very little supporting the overall economy in the Northeast Kingdom. There are dairy farms, but that's about it. It's a really poor region of the state, always has been. There's a prison in Newport. There is a feed factory in Newport, and not a heck of a lot else. Tourism is a draw, and so the ski areas are incredibly important to that local economy.
After the grand opening of the $25 million EB-5 funded stateside hotel and base lodge at the Jay Peak Ski Resort, owners Bill Stenger and Ariel Quiros began raising funds for what was dubbed, quote, the Northeast Kingdom Economic Development Initiative, a $600 million venture, the largest construction project in the state's history.
People love Bill Stenger, and that's because he's a rainmaker and he brought jobs to the region. In fact, at one point, there were signs on the town offices that said, "Thank you, Bill Stenger," and they were on the main doors to the town offices for many, many years.
After Stenger and Quiros announced their ambitious plans, Lefty Leahy, who'd pushed hard for EB-5 initiatives from the get-go, immediately jumped on the bandwagon, a move that smacked of conflict of interest.
Patrick Leahy has long had a close relationship with Bill Stenger. Senator Patrick Leahy wrote a letter of support that was used as part of an offering memorandum packet that was given to investors. And I've talked to investors who say, you know, if Senator Patrick Leahy hadn't written that letter, I probably wouldn't have invested. The reason I invested was because I believed that the state of Vermont and the senator were backing Jay Peak.
When they had the big announcement of the projects, the whole initiative, Senator Leahy and Sanders were here. Because they started out up at Jay Peak, and then they moved because they were going to do more expansion up there. Senator Sanders has come to Newport quite often, I think, and Senator Leahy has a personal connection. His wife's from Newport. This was a big announcement, so they expected everybody, I mean, the governor was even there.
Bernie Sanders was present in September 2012 when Ariel Quiros and Bill Stenger announced that they were going to be building an additional $600 million worth of projects in the Northeast Kingdom. That was on top of $282 million that they had already committed for Jay Peak, and everyone was there. Bernie Sanders was there, Peter Welch, our congressman, the governor, and of course, Senator Patrick Leahy.
Leahy was enthusiastic about it. When I testified before his committee, I was one of 3 expert witnesses. I was there, and I was the only person criticizing the program. On one side was a former Bush administration appointee who thought it was okay. And then on my right was Mr. Stenger, who was enthusiastically in favor of that program.
Steve Breaux is the owner and proprietor of the Newport Natural Market and Cafe.
I think every business, including myself, was very enthusiastic about seeing a large project come to town, which would mean more businesses, more jobs, more people. And I think everybody felt it was a good thing for the town, at least from a business perspective.
The egomaniacal developers' plans included the Renaissance block on Main Street in Newport and ANC Bio, a cutting-edge research facility. An entire city block was demolished to make way for a hotel and retail complex. And a highly publicized groundbreaking ceremony signaled the start of construction for the stem cell plant on the outskirts of town.
I always felt ANC Bio was going to be much more important to the economic growth because it was going to create high-paid jobs in the community. And it was going to bring in a lot of research scientists who would be here for, say, 6 to 8 months doing research. And the way I look at it is if people come here, they spend money, and some actually relocate, which helps the overall economy.
But in reality, Stenger and Quiros were brazen con men who were allegedly stealing funds from their backers. The developers diverted tens of millions of investor dollars to their own pockets, leaving little money for construction of the research facility.
More than 700 investors from at least 74 countries put their money into different projects at Jay Peak Ski Resort. Each investor probably had different reasons for wanting U.S. residency: sanctuary for safety or human rights concerns, access to education, or to tap into American financial markets. Most of them didn't bother to consult with immigration attorneys or review the EB-5 guidelines. And they became easy targets for unvetted bottom feeder builders and development planners whose modus operandi was to take advantage of those who could scrape the money together. The savviest scammers know how to skirt the system and walk away with tens of millions of dollars. And the greediest get caught with their hands in the till.
On April 14, 2016, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission filed a civil lawsuit and charged Bill Stenger and Ariel Quiros with 52 counts of federal securities violations, alleging they'd misused $200 million out of the $350 million they'd raised in investor funds for personal gain. Quiros had allegedly stolen over $55 million to buy, among other things, a $4 million condo on New York's Fifth Avenue and a $2.5 million crib on the Hudson River.
You had what they called the crown jewel of the Ponzi-like scheme, which was ANC Bio, which the SEC believes they never intended on building. That was the last project, and they basically were just taking money straight out of it. And so the SEC documents how Quiros was basically using the ANC Bio project as kind of like a personal piggy bank. Quiros is demanding his pound of flesh so that he can keep his lifestyle going. So he took money directly out of the accounts.
The development projects in Newport came to a screeching halt.
And I think disappointment was universal. It's bad enough when something like that happens in a wealthy community, but up here, where jobs are really, really hard to find, it was a massive blow.
I bought a second property. I invested another chunk of my inheritance money in another property to create an extended stay facility as part of my business.
Without EB-5, everybody was wondering what's going to happen.
Shameless Senators Leahy and Sanders pled ignorance and distanced themselves from the scandal.
Bernie Sanders, he has not been willing to talk to the press about what he thinks of Bill Stenger's involvement, and that's just wrong. You know, if you're in a position of power, you're a politician, and you're representing people, you're accountable to them. I just think it's offensive. It's offensive to democracy.
Daniel Horowitz is a senior editor at Conservative Review and specializes in immigration policy issues.
You had this boondoggle going on for years in Vermont, where they weren't just squandering one or two of the investors' funds. They squandered hundreds of millions of dollars. And, they kowtowed to this program for years and never said a word. It's hard to imagine they didn't understand the inherent flaws in it.
After years of promoting over-the-top pork projects for his home state, Leahy did a 180 and demanded that stringent reforms be put in place.
EB-5 financing has legalized crack cocaine.
In an effort to cover his tracks, Leahy joined forces with Republican Chuck Grassley, who spearheaded a campaign to expose flaws in EB-5, including fraud, abuse, and national security vulnerabilities.
The EB-5 program is the perfect example of how liberals like Bernie Sanders and Patrick Leahy, they're all for benefiting the rich and well-connected cronies. As long as the government is running the program.
Even Vermont Governor Pete Shumlin got in on the act. Once a staunch supporter of the EB-5 program and friend of Bill Stenger's, the legislator backed off, claiming he knew nothing about the accounting improprieties. But just 2 days after the SEC filed charges against Stenger and Quiros, Shumlin appointed state EB-5 investigator Michael Pichak as his new commissioner of the Department of Financial Regulations to head up an internal investigation into the case.
The governor hoped to show that he was saving the day by getting his agencies involved in scrutinizing the projects, but the investors say this is a little too late.
Commissioner Pichak and State Auditor Doug Hoffer declined to be interviewed for this program.
Governor Shumlin and his people should have known more about this. Once they did learn something about it, they tried to fix it, which is useful. But it would have been better had they nipped it in the bud, which they didn't do.
When Governor Shumlin and I spoke, I expressed my disappointment and concern for how the area had its economic hopes up. I told him I was shocked at the extent of it. I really truly was shocked at the extent of what happened. And he assured me that they would be here for us, and we were going to set up a meeting where we could meet face to face, myself, our city manager, Laura Dogan, and meet face to face with the governor so that we could start mapping out a plan for continuing.
Meanwhile, the federal government seized the abandoned projects in Newport and placed them in the hands of a court-appointed receiver.
Everything is in the hands of the receiver, Michael Goldberg, and the court. As far as any type of development, we've had inquiries. I've met with some potential developers for Main Street, but we can't do anything. We can't make any promises.
In September 2016, Bill Stenger cut a deal with the SEC.
I don't think Bill Stenger was manipulated. I think he knew all along what was going on. And the reason I can say that with some confidence is because I've read his very long deposition with the SEC. And in it, he acknowledges that he knew about the purchase of the resort with investor funds. In it, he acknowledges that he marketed the projects knowing that there were issues with backfilling projects, there were shortfalls all the way along. Many people have said that it would not have been possible for Ariel Quiros to pull off this fraud without the help of Bill Stenger. And so that's why the settlement is a no-contest situation. He could not admit or deny that he was involved at this juncture.
Well, right behind me is my business, and then right across the street is the project that never got finished. It got demolished, but no construction.
The fact that they were calling it Little Beirut and a hole in the ground was a deep concern for city officials. I call it an economic disaster for the area, for Newport. I knew it had to be serious by looking at the map. We saw how all the funds were funneled in different projects. And then I knew, deep down, I knew that we'd never see the projects in Newport come to fruition.
People are going to be sort of looking hard at a community like this before they invest in it. So that affects my future too. I'm not that young, so someday I might want to sell.
The aliens defrauding the United States, the middlemen particularly defrauding the aliens, the middlemen defrauding each other, lawyers sometimes doing bad things. This is a very complicated program, needlessly complicated.
Once you engage in green card social engineering, where you go and you take a scarce commodity of citizenship and you don't make it about a broad American policy, but you make it about benefiting special interests. Sure, you could try to regulate it, but that in itself breeds corruption.
As David North and other critics have pointed out, An entire side industry of economic book cookers has arisen to supply analysis of the job creation benefits of EB-5 projects. The numbers game involves gerrymandering census employment data to fit the program's definition of targeted employment areas in order to qualify for lower investment thresholds. It's like Solyndra and federal stimulus math on steroids. Look beyond the Vermont case, and you'll find the EB-5 program is being abused across the country. There are pending federal, state, local, and civil cases in California, Washington, Texas, New York, and New Jersey, to name a few. Some of the worst offenders reside in South Dakota. The South Dakota Regional Center, a state-run operation, is being described as the epicenter of what may be the second largest EB-5 fraud in the country because state officials, Republicans in this case, turned a blind eye to the blatant fraud allegations. In one instance, the South Dakota program invested heavily in a beef slaughterhouse the size of 5 football fields that went broke. The owners are accused of shipping millions of dollars to a corporation established in the Cayman Islands, which is managed by another corporation in Cyprus, which is owned by a shareholder of one of the major private sector owners of railway trains in Russia. Rather than monitoring the transparent projects, the South Dakota state officials instead promoted those involved in the ventures to ward off any questions or criticism. The convoluted money trail has left federal investigators running in circles looking like a bunch of rookies. 2 decades ago, when EB-5's failures were first exposed, Representative John W. Bryant, a Texas Democrat, protested on the House floor that, quote, "This provision is an unbelievable departure from our tradition of cherishing our most precious birthright as Americans." How many more foreign investor pay-for-play swindles must Americans endure before Washington reaches the obvious conclusion? The only effective way to reform this abomination is to kill it. And that wraps up our investigation for this edition of MMI. In today's social media mailbag, reader Matt sent me some photos that gave us a glimpse at political bias in his wife's teachers union. Matt emailed me, quote, "My wife is a teacher in Minnesota, where you are essentially forced to be in the teachers union." He's right about that. Minnesota is not a right-to-work state, which means that public school teachers are essentially required to accept compulsory unionism as a condition of employment. Opting out is extremely difficult. Mandatory teachers' union dues provide a massive political spending windfall for the National Education Association, which poured $40 million into the 2014 midterm elections and earmarked upwards of $82.1 million on national elections, local and state ballot measures, and other legislative efforts in 2016. An estimated 97 to 99% of NEA political spending since 1989 has gone to Democrats. As expected, Matt told me, his wife's NEA newsletter made Hillary sound like a savior to the schools and Trump like a demon trying to suck the life out of the education system. Like most education advocacy groups, they failed to take a fair and balanced look at both candidates. It's like they immediately were praising Hillary and damning Trump. These are the people brainwashing America's next generation in government schools. Chalk it up as another good reason to do it yourself and homeschool your kids. In today's Crap Weasel Watch, I've got my sights set on The View. It seems there's no end to demagoguery and double standards from the elitist divas who host the daytime bickerfest on ABC. One of the lowest lows of the year came when veteran cast member Joy Behar sneered at victims of Bill Clinton's sexual harassment and assault as, quote, tramps. After a backlash led by Paula Jones and Juanita Broderick on Twitter, Behar issued an apology, or rather a faux apology. Behar defended her smear by explaining that she meant it as a joke. Of course. That's a standard crap weasel excuse from liberal hate mongers. Another View co-host, comedian Michelle Collins, used that same excuse after making fun of a Miss America contestant from Colorado who delivered a heartfelt monologue paying tribute to her fellow nurses last year. Behar chimed in to mock the woman for wearing her stethoscope. The loudmouths stepped in it again when they publicly ridiculed the face of GOP presidential candidate Carly Fiorina. Collins bashed Fiorina for looking, quote, demented, and snickered that, quote, her mouth did not downturn one time. Behar said Fiorina's face should be, quote, a Halloween mask. And these snarling, nasty shrews had the audacity to criticize Donald Trump and other Republicans as woman haters? You would think that a groundbreaking TV show for women, created by female journalism pioneer Barbara Walters, would do its best every day to respect and uplift women. Instead, The View has turned into The Spew, a daily cauldron of contempt stirred by pampered, out-of-touch egomaniacs earning multi-million-dollar salaries to parrot Democrat talking points. It's way past time to pull the plug on these preening prima donnas gone wild. Sometimes crap weasels in heels and skirts are the worst crap weasels of all. At MMI, we love to shine the light on citizen watchdogs and whistleblowers keeping their eyes and ears on our government. Our Bulldog Award this week goes to Midwest mom Joy Pullman, one of the first researchers to dig deep on the federal educational Trojan horse known as Common Core. Unlike so many of the politicians in both parties who bloviate ignorantly about what's best for our children's education, Joy knows what she's talking about. She's a graduate of Hillsdale College, wife and mother of 4 children, all under the age of 5. Based in Indiana, she worked as a high school teacher of history, literature, and debate before becoming a writer and journalist. I first came across her work exposing Common Core's threat to academic excellence in the classroom in 2013. She and other Indiana moms warned the rest of the country that the federal standard scheme was undermining quality math and English language instruction in their local classrooms. Instead of accepting propaganda from education bureaucrats and corporate special interests who benefited from Common Core funding, Pullman did what any vigilant citizen should do. She sought out the facts for herself. Here's what she writes in her new book, The Education Invasion, which will hit bookstore shelves in January. I started trying to figure out who exactly made it and by what process. I contacted every major organization that was openly named as having a hand in it, as well as several dozen of the individuals listed as contributors on Common Core documents. Nearly all refused an interview. Others simply ignored my repeated emails and phone calls. Joy's refusal to sit back has resulted in invaluable reporting on the Common Core money trail, phony standards, and the threat to representative self-government. Her new book, The Education Invasion, is a must-read resource for every mom and dad in America. Thank you, Joy, for your relentless pursuit of the truth. Bulldogs rock.
Next on Michelle Malkin Investigates.
Privacy. It's our right. We deserve it, especially our kids. But do they have it? Hardly. And the worst part? Most parents have no idea.
I really don't believe that the federal government has the privacy of students as their first priority right now.
So what exactly is being collected? Disciplinary, health, even behavioral records. Files of data on your kids recorded by the government and private businesses all before they turn 18. And access to this information could brand a kid for life, tracking our children from womb to workplace.
What will happen for my child? Will he be discriminated against?
We unmask the big businesses cashing in on our children's educational data. We'll arm parents with the must-have info on which technology snoops to watch out for, which federal programs and laws are helping or hurting, and how to proactively protect their kids.
Seeing these kids in the park with their parents or guardians makes me think how sad it is that they don't know how much data is being collected about them and how already their privacy is being undermined by the systems we have in place. A lot of these parents are not aware of what's going on with their children's data.
If you've got a story to share, email me at michelle@michellemalkininvestigates.com. On this show, we dig deeper, shatter false perceptions, and get answers in the pursuit of justice. On behalf of our entire team, I'm Michelle Malkin. Thanks so much for joining us.